Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, whatever. Welcome to our regular K1 reunion meeting. And we're lucky to once again today have Don Baker, the esteemed
Don Clark.
retired Clark, Don Clark. Don
That's
Baker
right.
was here a month or
One of
two
those
ago.
Dons.
Sorry, they're both esteemed. Okay, but this is the esteemed Don Clark, retired from Trinity College, and he gave us a talk before about growing up as a missionary kid in Korea, and he's graciously agreed to come and do a fascinating report on the White Russians uh, in the East. And I'm going to pin you now, Dawn. Okay,
Okay.
here we go.
Can you hear
And
me?
take it away, my man.
Very good. Thank you. I love to see the group of these are friends who go back a long time.
Long way.
So yes, as right, which is the point, I guess. Anyway, I'm going to tell you a story, and the story is about this area of the East, which you may have been to. I don't know if anybody here has been to Vladivostok or Pakistan, either one, but that's what the story is about. It begins in a cemetery, a place that you've been, I think, maybe the Seoul Foreigners Cemetery, where our family has a plot because I have two little baby uncles buried in there from the beginning of the 20th century. And so when I was young, my father used to take us to the cemetery for picnics to do the good Korean thing of dusting off the gravestones and cleaning up the brush and stuff. And when he did that, we would have a picnic lunch, and then he'd drag me around and show me the various gravestones. I was like 12, and I couldn't have cared less. But actually, when you're 12, you actually absorb stuff that you don't realize you're absorbing. And he had known a lot of these people who are buried in this cemetery, and he would tell stories. Some of them, were about these questions. Who were they? Why did they come? What did they do? How did they die? What did they leave behind? You remember, I think, in Yongsan Library, a librarian named Sonny Murphy. I'll bet everybody remembers her. Sonny Murphy asked me in the early 80s to put together an inventory of who was in the cemetery because the records had basically been lost. And it was in the minds or, back of envelope notes of my father and also of people like the Underwoods and other families like this. So I put together a book, and the army put it out, the library put it out with this incoherent religious symbol on it, which, but anyhow, I did another one, which was much better in 1994 and involved more cemeteries like the foreign cemetery in Pyongyang and all around South Korea, the different foreigner cemeteries in places like Gwangju and Cheongju and such. And it told these stories, and it led to me I had a long-term friendship with the cemetery custodian, and he would also tell me stories of things that he had known because his parents and grandparents had kept the cemetery since 1890, when the first grave was laid. Anyway, this led me to the book of my life, which was published in 2003. I wanted to make a record of Western life in Korea, these based on these stories of people in the graveyard, who turned out to be a very wide assortment of people: missionaries, traders, diplomats, teachers, soldiers, military advisors. If you stitch together their stories, you would get a picture of what life was like under the Japanese occupation, the emergency evacuations of 1940, 41, and 1950, and even the destruction of North Korea. One of the things that my father would show me is the peculiar, which I thought was peculiar, the Russian Orthodox crosses in this particular area of the cemetery down here, because there was a Russian community in Korea. And he would explain that these were white Russians. Here's a common grave of three Russians who died on the Death March in 1952. I don't think they're actually buried there, but it's a memorial stone put up by the Russian community. And I would say, what I thought Russians were red. What are white Russians? And besides Kahlua, vodka, cream, and ice,
The dude.
you would, as opposed to red Russians. So the white Russians were people associated with the old regime, the regime of the Romanovs, and the story which maybe you learned, but I learned as a child, of Anastasia, who was rumored to have survived somehow and was somewhere hiding in Europe. Uh, I went to St. Petersburg once and had a guide named Anastasia, and I said, yeah, and she said, I was a princess in a previous life. Uh, well, maybe she was. I don't know. She's a lovely girl, but she really knew her way around the Winter Palace. So I figured maybe she was some sort of incarnation of Anastasia. Anyway, what were Russians doing in Korea? Uh, there, some of them had been teachers, some of them had been translators. If you go back around the turn of the century, just shy of 1900, at the turn of the previous century, there's a great book about this period that creates that studies the entire region in the 1880s and to about 1905, 1910. The background. This is not. I always have a tendency to think of Korea as sort of a thing by itself, and I have to think twice to place Korea in its regional environment. And the book by Sheila Jager, called The Other Great Game, is really a masterful account of the Russo-Japanese War and the years leading up to it, that puts Korea in its regional context, not only of Japan but also of China and the war in Manchuria. Anyway, this history. I'm not going to recount it, but the Russo-Japanese War uh, um, brought to the Russo-Japanese War era, brought to Korea a diplomatic and trading establishment of Russians who lived in Seoul, Pyongyang, and other places. And this building, the tower still stands. You know it well, so I'll skip over it. But it was certainly the center of the Russian community in Seoul. And the compound, the Russian legation compound, which is now all broken up into different things, but it's the center was the Russian Orthodox Church, which had a compound on the edge of the Russian legation compound, and here were apartments where a number of officials of the Tsar later on, and refugees of various sorts. I'm talking about after 1917, so that in the 1920s and 30s, this community is still very, very alive and well, but it's been cut off from Russia, so they're making a living the best they can, whether they're priests or whether they're small business owners or smugglers and prostitutes and the riffraff end of things. I don't know if this church was standing when we were in the Peace Corps, but later then it became this is the location of the Kengyang Shinmun, at where the Shinmun Rotary is. Anyway, never mind. At the top of the hill there of Samunan Row at Changdong. So, I mean, some of the characters who lived in the apartments, the little tiny apartment with a bathtub, Ivan Tikhonov, I think he's an interesting character, a chemist who would mix up cosmetics in his bathtubs and then peddle them around town. Soyang Hwajanpum, his brand was John's, and these were metamorphosis John's. It doesn't look too appealing in terms of packaging, but product of Russian immigrant material, comes from the USA. Anyway, here's this little map of Kidok. Anyway, the Russian Orthodox Church here. This is the Changdong Main Street, and Sodamun is down the hill here. Gwanghwamun is that way. So this is the location, as you well know. I don't need to explain further. Anyhow, he's a character, and he was other characters who lived in nicer apartments in the compound were, for example, the Churkin family, Sergei, Natalia, and their sons Vladimir and Kirill, whose diminutive names in Russian were Dima and Kiryusha. Sergei and Natalia Churkin lived in Seoul until the Second World War in the late 40s. He had been a diplomat in the service of the Tsar, but after the Russian Revolution, he stayed there and became a professor of languages at Solda, as Keicho Imperial University, teaching French, English, and Russian. These people were all, of course, multilingual. Sergei Churkin died in 1943 in Seoul and was buried at the Foreigner Cemetery, and this is the Russian ambassador at his grave. Well, I mean, by the eve of World War II, by the eve of Pearl Harbor, the international school that my father and I went to was basically out of business. There were more teachers than students, but among the students, four out of the 10 of them were Russians from across over the wall. The Kiryusha and Dima were there, and Nina Belogolovi and Toma. I always had a crush on Nina, and I never found her anyway. So the White Russians mainly had dispersed from Korea in 1950. After the Americans occupied South Korea, there were special kinds of United Nations related dispensations made by the U.S. government to allow people like them to make their way to the United States, and the Churkins made their way to the United States. Ivan Tikhonov, the chemist, being penniless, stayed in Korea until 1961, when finally he wangled an air ticket to get to New York, where he took up residence in like a farm maintained by Leo Tolstoy's daughter, called Tolstoy Farms, Alexander Tolstoy, and had been a place, kind of a halfway house for Russian refugees from all over the world, and then they would go from there to places where they might have had relatives or people who would help them make their way. So that's one thread of Russians. I'll go back to a thread of Americans because I'm going to connect the threads. The Taylor family, who I'm sure you've heard of, the Taylors were sort of like the dean of the business community in Seoul in the 1920s and 30s, and they owned the biggest house and the biggest Western style house, Dilkusha, which lately has been. Does Dilkusha ring a bell to you? Dilkusha, this house on near Sajik Park, where anyway they've made it into it's been restored as a historical site. Anyway, the original Taylor was a miner, a gold miner. His sons, Albert and William Taylor, ran a business in Sogongdong across from the Chosun Hotel, where they brought in the MGM movies, and they sold Chevys. They invested in all kinds of things. He was a stringer for Associated Press, so Albert and Mary Taylor, they were like the most distinguished civilians in Seoul, and they had a son, Bruce, and who later lived in California. Now I'll be back to Bruce, but meanwhile, I'll say about Mary that she wrote books. One of her books was about her very interesting life, called Chain of Amber. Her books were inventive. Where there were patches where she didn't know stuff, she made it up. And so, the books are a good read. I don't know if you've seen either one of these, but The Tiger's Claw was another one. And its subtitle is The Exploits of George Yankovsky, East Asia's Mighty Hunter. In the book, she tells the story of the Yankovskys. And it starts with a visit that she's having with Natalia Churkin, having tea on the Russian compound there by the church. I was visiting the Churkins for tea one afternoon when a lithe Russian teenager entered the room in soft leather slippers, dressed in a soft Indian smock, wearing tiger tooth earrings. The girl seemed shy, almost mysterious, and spoke only broken English, So Natalia had to interpret. She was Ora, or Victoria, the second daughter of the famous tiger hunter George Yankovsky at Novina. What was Novina? Well, if one believed the rumors, one must not only believe that Novina was a family of fabulous hunters, but that they lived in a castle which was prevented from sliding into an abyss by one great tree in North Korea that supported it. I hope you are imagining that this is in North Korea, in Hamgyeongbukdo, just south of the city of Cheongjin, up a river valley, which I'll talk about. But I don't want you to wonder where this is happening. The thing that makes this so unlikely and fun to follow is that this is so improbable happening in North Korea, even under the Japanese. So the castle had a high tower, which a gruesome dragon was kept prisoner because he'd fallen in love with the hunter's beautiful daughter. You see Mary's style, her inventive style. One had only to hear his woeful bellowings to know that this was true. Hearsay had it also that the hunter-in-chief had saved his wife's life by cutting out her appendix with his hunting knife. And it was also said that the family lived solely on tiger steak and vodka. But, said the informants, the even more remarkable thing was that the Japanese authorities allowed such barbarians to remain in the country and even let them fly the flag of all the Russians. So I knew Russians in Korea from the compound when I was young, but I didn't know anything about the Yankovskys. But this is George Yankovsky, the hunter-in-chief, with two leopards. Part of the amazing story is the kind of wildlife that were in the hills above Novina, where they lived in northeastern Korea. So the family had a crest and a flag, and George Yankovsky had his stalwart sons, which followed in his steps. George Yankovsky really did shoot tigers. He made himself a reputation. And he also shot boar, which were all over the hills of Paektusan in the 1920s and 30s. And the boars, I mean, I don't know if you've ever had boar meat. I've had bear and I've even had dog, but I've never had boar, unless you figure that these are just great big hairy pigs.
They are. They are.
Get pork out of them. So they sold the pork to they sold the pork as protein to the Japanese military, and they made a living by basically supplying the Japanese military. So here's where the location was of Novina, the colony that they established. But still, I'm telling the story from the beginning, so I don't want to jump ahead of myself. The original Yankovsky, which was Victoria's grandfather, was Mikhail Ivanovich Yankovsky, who was Polish. And he was caught up in the 1863 Polish uprising, for which he was punished severely by the Russians, and exiled to Siberia, along with many, many others. Here is a sad painting of, apparently there's this obelisk that marks the continental divide between Europe and Russia, out on the way to Siberia. And this is the crowd.
Are you showing maps and pictures? Because we can't see them.
I'm sorry, do you see? You don't?
I can see it, Don.
Yeah,
No, I can see it.
Where is it? Okay, never mind. I can't see it.
I can see them.
All right.
Okay,
I can see it.
Okay, it
All
seems
right.
like everybody except one can see it, Don.
I
Go
guess
ahead.
that's right.
okay, yeah, right. I'm thinking with horror about what if I'm just babbling on here and people are too polite to tell me that the thing isn't showing. But yeah,
We're not
so
that
this,
polite, Don. Oh.
yeah, okay, that's what I assumed in the beginning. So yeah, so they're headed for Siberia, and George or Mikhail Yankovsky had a scientific instinct. He fell in on as they were trekking east month after month with a group of environmentalists, naturalists, who had actually been hired by the Russian government to explore the Amur region of Siberia. And so he fell in with them and began to explore the area on his own. And even, as a hobbyist, began to discover species that were unknown in Europe.
Huh.
So I'll give you, so this is still called the Emberiza yankovsky, this bird, and the beetle, which I think I've had all over my house in Korea one time. Yankovsky's beetle, Coptalabras yankovsky, and a swan, which is rare, but it's in the zoo in Beijing. There's one, and I understand there's one in KL and Kuala Lumpur as well. A particular type of swan. What distinguishes it, I don't know, but I could look it up and find it. So then Mikhail Yankovsky then settled in what was to become the Vladivostok region of the Russian Far East, called the Primorsky Krai, and way down south of Vladivostok, almost to what is now the Korean border. And when he got there, he appropriated a peninsula on a beautiful bay, which is named Bietsverchovo, on what the Japanese call the Sea of Japan, a few miles south of Vladivostok. And that's where he set up his estate. It's still known as Yankovsky's Peninsula.
He was able to just grab this land?
Well, there was hardly nobody out there. There was hardly anybody out there, and the Russians had basically told these people, get out of Russia, go populate the East. And that's one answer. It wasn't the Russians to give. It had been part of Manchuria, until 18.
It was unpopulated, you mean?
It was underpopulated.
Or was it unpopulated the way the Western Hemisphere was when Columbus got here?
Yes, and I will say that the locals had to be sort of conquered or enslaved. So I take your point. I'll talk about their enslaving the locals a little bit later. Anyway, to protect him from, I guess, the angry locals, Mikhail Yankovsky built a splendid castle and lined it with guards and towers and moats and things, and started making a living off the Chinese market. What do Chinese like? Well, they like old Chinese men with flagging powers, like deer antler stuff. And so he raised a large herd of Sika deer and harvested the antlers every year. He grew ginseng, which is the same market, and timber, to which he shipped to Vladivostok. So they got markets in Russia. They got markets in China, and they had to, of course, fight predators. So that's where they got into hunting and shooting animals, including tigers, which would plague them, and other kinds of. There were also human predators. Maybe you know. Yes. Go ahead. There were also human predators called hungudza. They were red-bit. You remember the interesting names Chinese had for bandits, the silver swords, the long knives, and these were the red beards, the hungudza. And they were bandits, and they would kill and steal whatever they needed. This is, of course, as well, some of the best opium growing area in the country, in the world. And so the drug wars of the early 20th century in this area, I mean, it had a lot to do. Drugs, opium, poppies had a lot to do with the arrangements in this area. And these were the guys who would attack and try to steal from the Yankovskys. Mikhail Yankovsky was a very good hunter and a very good marksman, and he seemed to have eyes in the back of his head for people sneaking up on him, for which reason he was given the nickname by the Koreans of Nenun, Four Eyes, because he had eyes in the back of his head. I mean, I guess he had to be there, but still, the name then descended to his son, who became named an Adel, and then his grandchildren, the grandchildren of old Four Eyes. Anyway, old Four Eyes, Mikhail Yankovsky died in 1912, and his son George was in charge of the estate at Sidami, which means the place where one sits on the Yankovsky Peninsula at Biezverkovo. Yankovsky had partners. I won't take too long with this, except to say that one of them was a Swiss named Julius Brinner, who married a Mongolian woman with a Russian name, and they had a son named Yul Brynner. So Yul Brynner, the actor, was born at Sidami and on the Yankovsky Peninsula, and his son Rock wrote a book about him. The Man Who Would Be King is the name of the book, and Rock Brenner and I have traded some stories about these people. Anyhow, another thing that they grew was horses. You may know that Asian, at least Siberian horses, are not built for speed. They're chunky, and some of them are like the Manchurian pony, are nasty little animals with hiss and spit, and they're a little bit bigger than a Saint Bernard, but anyway, they're not good race horses. The Yankovskys were into horse racing. Vladivostok had a racetrack, and it was a big occasion for, like Ascot. Well, anyway, so the Yankovsky boys were sent to study horse breeding in the United States, in Texas, and they bought a bunch of horses in the Bay Area and around the Bay Area in California, and shipped them to Sidami. And so they had a racehorse. They had horse stables at Sidami. Okay, so the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Revolution, and then the Civil War that happened in the late teens. It took the Bolsheviks until 1923 to conquer the Russian Far East. The Reds and the Whites went at it hammer and tongs, and many white Russian children were shipped to the Far East on boxcars to get out of the way of the Bolsheviks. People who were trying to get out of the way of the Bolsheviks were people who had owned land or were enemies of the people, etc. You know that Japan, Britain, and the US were all interested in defeating the Bolsheviks and invaded in various places like Minsk, and the Japanese and Americans together went ashore in the Far East and followed the railroad eastward to try to stop the advance of the Reds into Siberia, and of course the Japanese didn't want them anywhere near Japan. So that's another story. The Bolsheviks finally conquered the Vladivostok area in 1923, and here were the Yankovskys, big landowners and enslavers. Well, they didn't pay very well. The Koreans, at Sidami, they used Koreans because they were, as they said, reliable and decent, where Chinese were like bandits in sheep's clothing, and they couldn't be trusted. But Koreans were reliable, and it would work for next to nothing. So they had an army of Koreans at Sidami in Biezverkovo working for them, and because of that, they knew that they were in big trouble when the Bolsheviks took charge, and so they gathered up their children and got out of the way. They would have been denounced as capitalist pigs and exploiters. The story about that in Almaty in Kazakhstan, there is a large Korean community, and maybe you've been there. They have their own newspapers and things, and this is just a screenshot of the of a novel written by a Korean, a Koryo saram named Myung Chul, called Mao Saramdil, Village People, about the Yankovskis and all the terrible things that they did to Koryo saram when they enslaved them in the Biosferkovo and also Novina areas. So that's their version of the story. Meanwhile, in 1923, the Yankovsky family took their steamboat and pulled a barge full of horses, deer, equipment, tools, everything they could load on it, and went south to Cheongjin, where they went ashore safely out of reach of the Russian Bolsheviks. There they rented a little Korean house and moved in and tried to make a living. They first tried to use their racehorses to haul freight. They got into the carting business. This is not a good use for racehorses. Neither do they pull great loads. That's not what they're for. And so they had to auction off their racehorses, which was a very sad occasion. They then got into fishing, and they are packing up barrels of herring to supply to the Japanese. And that's how they started supplying food to the Japanese, the Yankovskis in Cheongjin. They also invested in a riverbank estate up the valley of the Chuul River. There's so many rivers in Korea and so many valleys with rushing streams. This is the only context in which I've ever heard of this river, but the Chuul River, and there were hot springs there. And so they invested, they leased, bought a valley up the Chuul River from Cheongjin, basically. Up this valley were the foothills of Baekdusan. And they made their living by horse breeding, deer breeding, hunting wild boar, selling meat, poultry farm, orchards and fields, beekeeping, milling lumber, and tourism. They advertised the cool air of the mountains in the summer to Russian communities all over East Asia, who then began showing up to vacation. And that they created a resort out of it, as well as a farm. They had, of course, barns and things. They had their livestock, always the deer. I don't know about this random goat, but anyway.
Don,
and yes,
were the Russian tourists white Russians?
yes, white Russian communities from Harbin, from Shanghai, Nagasaki, of course, Tianjin, all of those places, but most of all from Harbin and Shanghai. And they would come and rent cabins. So there was like constantly, this might be the tower that Mary Taylor was writing about that, had the dragon in it. I don't know, but anyway, the tower is called the Tower of the Ancestors. And it was an important landmark of Novina. So you see that it's a community of people. Sometimes people there's a Yankovsky Historical Society run by Jacques Swetzlut. You know him? Of course you do. Yeah, in Seoul, and they collect. We collect Yankovsky memorabilia if you have any. And they would bring a priest down from Harbin for Easter, and carry on. They brought up their sons as manly hunters. Each kid had a good dog and a great gun, and they would go out hunting. Arseny and Valery, the two oldest sons, actually shot a tiger once and proudly displaying it in this picture. Victoria also had a gun, took after her father, and was an expert marks lady. The first time I saw this picture, I was very interested to see in 1932 that I didn't know that there was anyone in the whole place wearing a costume like this, but this is like her favorite picture of all time. My daughters actually then said, "Dad, look what she did. She scraped out her waist a little bit to make herself skinnier." I don't know, you know, Jennifer and Joanna, they would see a picture like this and find a way to berate it. Okay, never mind. Victoria had her own little, her dad built her a little house on the riverbank, and that's where she would write her poems and essentially live the life of a kind of a romantic. She had a pet lynx.
Mhm.
Did you know that there were lynxes in Korea? I didn't know there were even leopards in Korea, but here's this lynx, and he's got look at his ears, and he's Chris, and he was a nice cuddly lynx until one day he killed the chickens, and went bad. He went bad. He disappeared, and Victoria. But anyway,
Was she heartbroken?
she was heartbroken. It's true.
I
Her-
would be too.
Lynx in North America are not known for being cuddly.
I want him to come live at my house.
Well, in one of the books written by her brother Valeri, he talked about how important this lynx was to his sister and how grieving she was when the lynx went bad and killed the chickens and disappeared. But I guess it was inevitable that it would happen. Eva, the older sister, was a different kind of person. She was a champion horsewoman who won awards in Vladivostok when she was like 16, and all, but she didn't shoot things so much. She's really kind of different kind of person. And they appropriated or somehow obtained the use of this beach down on the shore, uh, and they built a resort at a place that they named for a character in out of Pushkin called Lukomori. And so anyway, all right. So word about Novena got around. Tigers, bears, wild boar, leopards, lynx, wolves, foxes, etc., mountain goats, pheasant, geese, wood hens, and you may remember from your general exams a book, 1938, by Sten Bergman called "In Korean Wilds and Villages," and there's a whole chapter in here devoted to Sten Bergman, the Swede, visiting Novena and being amazed by the wonderful hunting that was in that area. They would hike up the valley stream. Valeri would take some of the summer visitors hunting himself. Victoria would take kids up the river to hike and play. They would take the lumber train down the river, down the mountain, careening down the mountain on tracks for the fun of it. Nobody, as far as I know, got killed doing that, but it must have been rather dangerous. So playing upstream, skinny dipping and sunbathing. There were two famous girls in the 1930s called Vera Chernaya, Vera the brunette, and Vera Belaya, Vera the blonde.
Don,
Yes.
Don, is this
Yes.
really the sort of picture that a missionary kid should be looking at?
Well, I snuck it. I snuck it.
Are you do you have your eyes closed right now?
Come on.
Well, well, Vera the
Just
blonde.
checking.
Yeah. Vera the blonde took up with Valeri. She was already married to an engineer, a Scottish engineer in Shanghai, but she would come up for the summer and hang out with Valeri, who wanted her to leave her engineer husband, but she wouldn't. At the end of the summer, she would go back, and then after 3 years, they sadly broke up.
Here.
And the last we heard of her, she was in Delhi with their engineer husband. Sent Valeri a photo postcard of herself feeding ducks on a Delhi pond. I don't know. Those are details. So they were summer guests. They had great banquets. They told stories around the fire and sang sad Russian songs. The theater people from Shanghai would come up and they would do what they do, which is have theater. And they would bring the girls in, Victoria and Aura, to act in some of the plays. They did this and then they made their own amusements. So you remember Mary Taylor, the author of those books. And one day in 1989, I got a call out of the blue from Bruce Taylor in Mendocino, California. Bruce says, I hear you're looking for Russians from Korea. And I said, well, actually, I am. I would really like to find some of these people. And he said, well, the next time you're in the Bay Area, come out and I'll show you, I'll introduce you to Kiryusha Shirkin. Now, do you see, I don't see in the pro, can you see Kiryusha
Uh-huh.
in
Yeah.
the picture? Okay,
Uh-huh.
all right. It's just my screen. So I went out and I met Kiryusha, and Kiryusha said, yes, there are Yankovskis all over here. I think they're up by Santa Rosa, but I'm not sure where. Why don't you go out to Little Russia and ask around? Someone will know. Now, it happens that when I was in college, I took Russian. I was taught by a exiled Latvian countess named Erika Birnbaum. And Erika Birnbaum would make us read, things by Tolstoy in English, and then she would make us read them in Russian. And we had to do a great deal of reading back and forth in translation and also in Russian itself. So I would go down to the Bay Area and to this bookstore on Geary Boulevard in Little Russia and shop for my books, my dictionary, my novels, etc. And then next door there was a bakery which served really great piroshki, and I went there many times and bought many books. There was an ancient babushka in the bookstore who got to know me for several of my trips. My sister was was in Berkeley. She was in her beatnik phase, and so I would go down to visit her often, and then end up in this bookstore. And here was this babushka, and he would say, "What's wrong with you? Your Russian is terrible." And she'd be looking at me. I know many Russians now who have told me that this is how Russians talk. They would never, if you're in Korea, they'll lie to you and tell you how good your Korean is. But here the Russians don't miss words.
That's funny.
Russian. Toy Ruski очень плохой. So now again in 1989, after meeting Kiryusha, I go out to Little Russia, out Geary Boulevard to Little Russia. It's changed. It's like 25 years.
Mm.
And I drive out, and it doesn't look terribly familiar. And a little voice in my head says, pull in here. And so I turned into one of these slots and parked. And there across the street was the bookstore. Not the same name, but the same bookstore. And I'm fascinated by how it is that I knew intuitively to park there across the street. And here was another ancient babushka. And I said, do you know a family named Yankovsky? And I don't know if you've been in some of these ethnic neighborhoods where if you come in and try to speak English, they say, what the hell? What's he trying to say?
Yes.
No idea. That happened to me to a Polish bakery once in Brooklyn. It was like, who is he? What is he trying to say? Anyway, so do you know a family named Yankovsky? And she calls the girl and she says, "Что он говорит? What's he saying?" And she sent her back to the shelf where she pulled out this book called From the Lands of Exiles, Po stranam Rosyania by Victoria Yankovskaya.
Whoa.
And I opened it up, and here's the picture. And more to the point, where Victoria lives. She lives in a slot number 18 of a trailer park in Healdsburg, California. Well, I laid rubber out of there, and I called her on the telephone. There was a way to do that, and I met her on the Russian River in 1989.
Wow.
And I said, I want to hear your stories. I want to see your albums. I wonder how what you've been doing all these many years. And of course, on the mantle was her favorite picture of herself, and other pictures around the famous tiger earring picture. And she told me so many stories. I went back 4 or 5 times, flying out from Texas, just to go see her, to meet her son. Her sister came up from San Francisco, and told stories with her. One day they were sitting down together and we were eating. She said, "It's time for lunch." And I said, "Okay, well, that's fine. Thank you. I'll share whatever you have." And she brought out an entire plate of hot dogs. And she says to me, "You're a big man. You must eat." These are carnivores from Novena. Well, Novena lasted about 20 years. The family's fate is told in one of Valeri's books. For those 20 years, I think this quote was really almost brought tears. In retrospect, the Russian exiles, both in Novena and Lukomori, lived, as the Russian saying goes, as if under Christ's shirt in paradise.
Mm.
That's how much they had loved Novena, but it didn't last. Eva was the first to leave. She married a guy in one of the Shanghai visitors and went to Shanghai to live with him and had a son. Mama Daisy Yankovsky died of cancer in 1936. Victoria married one of the farm hands and moved to Harbin and had a baby who died in infancy.
Oh.
During the Second World War, National Geographic wrote up Novena in an article called Jap Rule in the Hermit Nation, October 1945, which had some really great pictures of Novena and the people who lived there. But they were in trouble again because they were collaborators, of course. When the Soviets occupied, the Red Army occupied North Korea, they put them under arrest. George Yankovsky was confined, arrested, imprisoned, and died in 1956. The family were put to, became displaced people. The second son, Arseny, learned that he was about to be arrested by Smersh, and he crossed with his wife Olga, hiding in the back of a truck into the 38th parallel into South Korea in late 1945, where immediately he was recruited by U.S. Army intelligence because he knew languages. And he became a CIA operative, a case officer during the Korean War, and then was summarily fired during the McCarthy era, just for grins, just for good measure. He didn't do anything, but his name was like Russian sounding. So in the McCarthy era, people got fired for just in case. But his most famous client was somebody you may have heard of called Nogum Suk, who flew 17 minutes from Pyongyang Sunan Airport to Kimpo in a fully intact MiG-15 in 1953. We didn't know enough about MiG-15s, and we were extremely happy to get this airplane. And of course, we painted it in the U.S. Air Force colors. But Nogum Suk was Andy. Let's see, Arseny took the name Andy Brown. On the American side, he was known as Andy Brown, and Andy Brown was the handler for Nogum Suk. Took him to Okinawa and tried to got everything out of him that he could about the Kim Il Sung's air capabilities, and of course they were they reverse engineered the MiG. Nogum Suk later became Kenneth Rowe, and he was a science teacher in Florida until he died just a few years ago.
Oh.
Arseny, meanwhile, after he was fired, became an officer of Mitsubishi in Tokyo and worked there for a couple of decades before he moved to California and died in 1979, I think, buried in the Serbian cemetery in San Francisco. The others, Valery became a novelist in Moscow. Victoria and Yuri died young in a labor camp in Siberia. Eva had a career with the U.S. Civil Service in San Francisco, and she and her sister together spent 10 years in Chile waiting as UN displaced people, waiting for a visa to the United States. They also went through Tolstoy Farm and then to Russian town in San Francisco, where Victoria eventually invested with a new husband in a resort on the Russian River in Healdsburg, which is where I found her. Did they ever go back? Well, yes, in 1991, a monument and a statue were erected in Birzverkovo in memory of Mikhail Yankovsky, the original Yankovsky, and Victoria and her son Or and the grandchildren went out to, and Valery, the brother, went to the unveiling of the stone and the statue in 1991. And Victoria wrote for the Vladivostok papers a poem and called "Can These Tears Ever Forgive Russia?" I won't read the poem to you, but that was a very sentimental thing. And then Victoria, who was born at Sydney, died in 1996 in California. I apologize for taking so much time, but here they are. I would love to hear some questions. I would love to hear some reactions.
I have a question, if I could, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Okay, I'm fascinated by your account of was it Victoria who finally settled in the Russian River in Healdsburg? I think of my one-time sister-in-law, who I still have contact with from time to time, who is descended, I think, through her grandfather and grandmother from Russians who came to California back at around the turn of the past century. The Russian River is not named the Russian River by coincidence, as I understand it. It's because there was a large settlement of Russians in that area going back a few generations. Can you speak to that? And I wonder about Victoria, for one, and maybe other members of the family settling in that area, if there was a connection to the Russians who had come to California years before.
Yes, as we know, the Russians were much in Alaska and then came down the coast and they're still in enclaves in the Pacific Northwest. Of course, Fort Ross, and you're right. The Russian River it's not the Peruvian River. It's for a reason. The Russian River is a one of the concentrations, so that when in the 1950s and 60s, when Victoria was moving there, they moved there because there was so much Russian, society to be with, and of course her clients at the resort she built were Russians. So yeah, there's a heavy Russian presence.
So how far back does that go? Do you know, Don?
Well, she's coming up from San Francisco, but the Russians coming down from Alaska. If I know that every place like Seattle, for instance, has a Russian community and Russian Orthodox churches. So who those families are, I don't know. If I went deeper, I would be able to connect things up better as an answer. I know that in Oregon there is a community near Salem of what are called Old Believers.
Yes, they're around Wilsonville.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Old Believers are
a different denomination, isn't it?
Yes, it's a denomination of Russian Orthodox, but hyper conservative. It's like, I suppose it would be maybe like Hasidic. Anyway, unique and keeping very much to themselves and disciplining their own community. They are also from the drift down from Alaska. But I don't think that the Russian Orthodox Church in Sitka, for instance, I don't think is an Old Believer church. But I know that in Kamchatka, where I've been, the Old Believers it's thick with Old Believers, and the most conservative and strict religion imaginable. That's not an answer very good, so I'm going to stop trying. But yeah, she would put on in Fort Ross, there would be a Easter celebration for the Russians, and she would dress up in a Russian costume, elaborate Russian costume. She was very proud of, and get her picture taken at the Fort Ross. Fort Ross is a stockade, which is a Russian stockade, and that's where they would hold their celebration.
Don,
Yes, Ed.
I don't see a way to raise my hand, but anyway.
I saw it.
Good. The Red Russians conquered Vladivostok in 1923,
Yes,
but it sounds from your tales as if there were a lot of White Russians hanging around in Siberia for some time after
yes.
that. When did the Red Russians succeed in really controlling Siberia?
Well, that was, I think I would say that 1923-24 was when they took control, political and police control of the Russian Far East, of the Primorsk, the Ussuri River, the Ussuri area, and everything up to Khabarovsk. West of that, of course, is Manchuria, and you know that Harbin is a Russian city. So the Chinese Eastern Railroad, the Russian Railroad, trying to shortcut. Well, it took so long to build the Trans-Siberian that they wanted to go straight through Manchuria with the railroad straight to Vladivostok, whose central city was Harbin, which connected to the South Manchurian Railway, which went to Port Arthur, which the Russians also built for the Japanese to use. And so all of those communities, Dalian, Port Arthur, had Russian communities. All of the towns around there had some Russians. The whole, all around the Yellow Sea. I'll tell but the areas of Manchuria that were Korean, I don't remember hearing much about Russians in that area. I'll tell you why I bring that up, because my parents, my father and mother, Jean and Alan Clark, were sent to preach the gospel to the Korean communities in Lungjingsun and anyway, and they were living in a Western style house which got shot up by Hunghuze. And if the Russians had been there in any kind of force, there would have been better. The Hunghuze would have been better under control. That area was still coming under. This is 1933, 30 to 35. That area was still coming under control by the Japanese, Kempeitai, and of course they did establish their puppet state. We just didn't answer your question at all, but I think that you find enclaves of Russians just everywhere, all around the place,
including in Siberia,
including of White Russians. No,
White Russians.
It depends on. I don't know that much about Siberia itself. I know the Primorsk area and the literature about that, but and the stories, but I don't remember that White Russians. If you were a White Russian in Siberia after 1920, you would keep it to yourself. I mean, you would be required to you certainly would be in deep trouble if you associated yourselves with the troops from Japan and the United States that were coming in along to block the advance of the Reds.
Yeah.
Beyond, so the people who were indelibly white, can white be indelible? Indelibly white, white Russians moved themselves into Manchuria.
So, Don, this
Yes.
is Bob Baskerville.
Hi, Bob. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I found this intensely interesting.
Great.
I was a Russian language major, And
Okay.
before I was in the Peace Corps, I had a job in the Soviet Union with the U.S. On a U.S. exhibition as a Russian speaking guide.
Wow.
And at that time, my closest friend was a fellow named Bob. Yeah, and I tried to alert Gorohoff to this so that he could listen, but I was unable to contact him. He's now in his 90s, and I don't know if he could have appreciated, but I think so, because his mother's father
Yeah.
was the principal at the gymnasium in Harbin.
Okay.
He was in charge of I guess it was like a gymnasium, that is to say, it's a high school and
Yeah.
grade school, and all through they ended up there in 23 because they had to escape from Vladivostok.
Yeah.
And Ken's father, that was his mother's family. His father was was in the Navy as a cadet, and that is the White Russian Navy, of course.
Yeah.
So in 23, he also had to escape by commandeering a vessel. At any rate, they both ended up in this eventually in Shanghai, but during the interim period that you're talking about, when Novena existed, they lived in Harbin. And in the summer, they went down to Korea. I mean, I just heard briefly this. They went down to Korea for recreation in the mountains. Now, so I will send a recording of this to Ken and hope that he will appreciate it. But I imagine that he would know something about this.
Yes.
And his family, which is now, all gone. But it's.
I don't know families that came from Harbin, but I know families that are now in the United States and families that are in Australia that did that. That is, that converged. But it sounds. I would, please don't fail to let me know what that turns up. That would be fabulous.
Right, I'll put you two in touch. I think that might be very.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Yeah, there's
Hey,
a fellow.
Dawn, go ahead. Go ahead, finish. Bobby managed to raise her hand when you finished.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Can I ask? Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, you have just opened up a whole new world for me. I never had heard any of this before.
No, I hadn't heard of it either.
Absolutely fascinating. And I think I want to read some more about it. The reason my only comment is kind of silly, but your wild boar.
Yes.
We eat them in Japan, and when I was in the Peace Corps training, and did our practice teaching in Hilo, not in Hilo, in the Kona coast.
Kona.
The family that I stayed with, they went out and caught a wild boar and cooked it Hawaiian style.
Oh,
Are these the feral pigs that everybody was
Yes,
warned?
that's a feral pig.
Right.
Not
But
a wild.
they still are edible, right? I mean, they're pork, right?
They're pork. They're perfectly good. They're not quite as greasy as pigs.
Well,
They're not kosher, by the way.
I'm sure they're not kosher.
well, the Japanese army seemed to like them. So, but you could see how plentiful they were when they would bring in a whole brace of these things, like 12 huge wild boars. And so they had a slaughterhouse and they had a, whatever it is, a butcher shop. I don't think they cut up the animals themselves. I think they had some of the people that the Koryo-saran were complaining about do it.
No. Well, it's a good source of protein.
Yes, sure, of course. And I didn't know that. So you actually partook of Hawaiian feral pigs?
Yes.
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 Okay. All right.
Okay. But also in Japan, I've eaten it in Japan too.
Yes. And
actually, I wish they would come and get some of the wild pigs that are digging up our backwoods too. I mean, they're all over the place. They're a pain in the neck.
You have a rifle, I hope. Yeah. So yeah, I think Ed had his hand up.
Uh,
Yeah.
I know that you haven't said much about Japan, but I had an experience that might be somehow related. In 1976, I spent a few months in Japan, and I got to know Ron Toby very well.
Sure.
And he and I were going running in the morning together and that kind of thing. And one Saturday, he took me to the synagogue. And at the synagogue, there was a very old man who surely is not with us any longer, who was a white Russian refugee from St. Petersburg or Moscow, where his family owned a department store or something. And he asked me, you know, what kind of Jew are you? And I, you know, there I am with a shawl on and so forth. I had to admit that I was not. But the congregation was gathered together that particular time to welcome some middle-aged men from their community who had moved to the United States and who were obviously very prosperous. And they were quite interesting people. I didn't take systematic note of what they had to say. But,
where was this? What place in Japan was this?
Tokyo.
In Tokyo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tokyo. I don't know if there's more than one synagogue in Tokyo.
I'll bet there are.
Well,
Can I just,
I know a little about this. So
Okay.
I meant to ask you
Carl-
a question. Yes.
Carl Moscow is it.
When I lived in Japan in 1964-65, the Jewish community center there was mostly white Russian. And in my school, there were a lot of other white Russians, and some of the people had moved from Harbin, others from Shanghai. And there were other white Russians, not Jewish, in Japan and elsewhere. But some of these people, as you say, they'd go on to the United States or to Israel and then come back because they were experienced as entrepreneurs and traders in Asia, like that. The Myungham, the name card of Valerie when he's working for TRW in Tokyo, he looks like he probably fit right in, although obviously not Jewish. But I was going to lead to another question, Don. If you look at the summary of U.S. occupation plans for Japan, not Korea, before Japan surrendered, there's a whole section devoted to Russians in Japan, and they particularly mentioned throughout Japan, and this is not Korea necessarily, but mainland, there was a whole group of itinerant Russian peddlers, and so for them, so they were enough there that the occupation was actually making plans for them as a separate group. I mean, the plans were basically be aware of these people and how they were, since Russia was one of the victors in the end of the war, they had to make some account for them. But I was just leading back to the fact that it was I don't think they were the only Russians in Japanese controlled Korea. I think there was probably a larger group of Russians there and people engaged in trade with Manchuria, Harbin, and Shanghai. End of comment.
I just wanted to interject, if I might, back on Ed's comment about Ron Toby taking him to the synagogue in 1976. I think this was still applicable information at the time. I don't know how many Jewish community centers there were in Tokyo during the late 60s and mid 1970s. I don't think that there were very many. I was under the impression that there was only one, which I visited in the summer of 1969. And the leader of that community, the person who, let's say, he wasn't, he actually had all the credentials to be a rabbi. And he was, in effect, the rabbi of that community and led services on Friday night and on Saturday. And his name was Harold Plonchek. And Harold Plonchek was my Torah teacher when he was my bar mitzvah teacher when I was growing up in Philadelphia. And he moved to Tokyo to go into the pearl business, import, export pearls, and made quite a lot of money doing that, but also became a leader of the Jewish community at that time. So I'm thinking that Ron Toby's adventure with you, Ed, probably led you to meet my old Torah teacher, Harold Plonchek, at the time.
Nick has
Quite
had
likely.
Carl, the Russians in Japan at the time of the U.S. occupation, were they from Sakhalin, or were they concentrated any place, or were they?
The documents I read didn't mention any particular location. What struck me was itinerant peddlers, because I was just imagining what the lifestyle and life of a person being an itinerant peddler in Japan for their lifestyle would be. No, I don't think they were from Sakhalin. I think they were White Russian origin and had come through Siberia and out of Harbin at some time. And since the Japanese, after in the 1930s, controlled Manchuria and then the rest of China and Shanghai, from some of those few stories I know, and I went to the American school in Japan, and I had classmates who were from this group of White Russians. And some of the stories I've heard and seen when I've read about them, many people were going back and forth to Shanghai and Harbin, and it was just the Japanese Empire was an empire, and they had a lot of other different peoples under it. And what we've sort of mentioned is the Jewish White Russians, but the Jankowskis were Polish and considered White Russians because they came from Russia, but there were many different groups. I'm going to hold the floor for another 15 seconds and say we just came back from a visit to the Baltic countries. We were there for about 3 weeks in Estonia and Latvia, where Don's Russian teacher came from, and Lithuania. And when you look at the history of those places, and it was not just the USSR. They've got their freedom from the USSR in 1989-90 when the USSR imploded. But you go back to the old Russian Empire, they controlled them. And many groups of people were being put on trains and deported to Siberia for most of recorded history. End of comment.
Nick, you want to ask a question?
Yes, and make a comment. I want to thank Don. This is a very interesting exposition. It extremely broadened my very thin understanding of these topics. And I thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it. And my next two questions, one is slightly relevant and one is barely relevant, will reveal just how little I know. But it's my vague understanding that White Russia is, like, among other things, like a geographic area, which is now called Belarus. Is that right?
Bielo means white.
So when we talk about Russia, we could be talking about just people from that area. Is that true?
No. White Russia. No, I don't know why Belarusia is called Bielorussia, but White Russians are a genre of Russians who are anti-communist or opposed to the Bolsheviks, or
I've understood that
part of the diaspora,
right? Or they carry some sort of fatal feature that Red Russians would punish and have to flee. So, like, if they were big landowners or people with lots of employees, or I don't know, people who might not survive Bolsheviks.
Okay, so then the people from what's called now Belarus would not be persecuted necessarily because they were from that area.
No,
only because they're from Belarus.
Pardon, Carl?
I said they're persecuted only because they're from Belarus.
Oh, right. In the same way that Latvians are persecuted, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, okay. So there's a tenuous connection in that sense. And my last question is, you started off talking about the foreign cemeteries.
Yeah.
And excuse me for revealing myself, but I've been enjoying, well, recently, a video series called Mr. Sunshine,
Oh,
which
yes.
which concludes at that cemetery.
Yes.
Or, I think the one perhaps in Seoul. I'm not sure. I don't. I just was wondering, have you seen that series?
I started it and never finished it, so I never got to the part that you're describing.
Okay. Well,
But
anyways,
yeah, I know a lot of people who've seen it and they refer to it a lot and tell me how much they enjoyed it, but they aren't people who studied this history and are constantly being irritated by inventions in this Korean series, even though it's a beautiful series and it's fun to
Right.
watch.
I believe
lighten
I
up.
watched the entire series, but I don't remember the cemetery scene at the end.
it's the I'd say it's the very last frame of
Yeah.
but what I want to say is the very first of the episodes has a interesting event, and I'd like to know if anybody knows if there's any historicity to it at all. And that is, there's a American official whom Mr. Sunshine will say was assigned to apparently assassinate in Seoul. He was called, I think, Mr. Logan or something like that. And I was wondering, so he was assigned that by FDR, according to the movie. So it's a very sort of strange way to start the movie. But I was wondering if there was any American who was so hated by Washington that they arranged to have him assassinated.
Not that I know of in that context, certainly.
I'm sorry. This would be like 1902 or something like that.
Oh.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Unknown to you. It was extremely strange. I just
Yeah.
wanted to know if there was anything to it. Okay, that's it.
Well,
Thank you very much.
It's an enjoyable series.
It is.
And it's where I live, it certainly attracted a lot of people to be interested in Korean stuff. I didn't have the heart to tell them that I thought it was partly made up.
Oh, no, it's mostly made
Dan,
up.
Did you have Dave? Did you have a comment?
Just that it was
Dave,
a,
I can't.
just
I
that it
thought
was
you
a,
had your hand up.
yeah, oh, no, Ann and I have to skedaddle off in a minute, but I just wanted to say to Don how good it was to see you and what a really compelling narrative this was, and just so much about Korea and related to Korea that I just was not aware of. So thank you so much.
Before you leave, Dave, can I just put in a good word for Don's book, which he only made very fleeting mention of, and showed a very brief picture of the cover on one of his slides, which is called Living Dangerously in Korea. Maybe you can show us that slide again, Don. But I was fortunate enough to receive a copy of that from Don and read through it. And it's a really fascinating book, which goes into these stories and many others having to do with foreigners coming to live in Korea, beginning about the middle part of the 19th century. Am I correct, Don? And then going up through the turn of the century and into the middle part of the 20th century. So I highly recommend that book to everyone. It's fascinating reading.
I'm going to be down at the Watertown Library on Monday. I'll get a copy. But thank you. Yeah.
The book.
I get going, but thanks.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah.
Good to
And
see everybody.
everybody, hello.
Yeah.
Don, that was great. It was really wonderful.
Right.
Thank you. It was great. Very, very,
it.
very interesting.
Thank you, Don.
Wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. It was really
Yeah. I mean, well, I have the book, but it's nice to have you tell it to us again.
Yeah, there's a chapter in the book about it.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Don.
you. Good to see you.
Come back again.
Thank you for
I will.
entertaining us with these wonderful stories.
It was fantastic. Fantastic.
Bye.
Okay. See you all next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Can't even